Andy, you've shared some really interesting work with us where you've been trying to think through how, in a screen-based culture, our kids are living just surrounded, immersed in a screen-based world. Then the hyperreal is overtaking the real, the sign is overtaking the signified. This puts some pressure on youth ministers to try to lift their game to make it as snappy, as appealing, as engrossing as what the kids are used to. But I know you have some concerns about that. What are they?
Yeah, I think that we often think that, well, if you're going to do good youth ministry, if you're really going to be able to attract kids, if you're going to be relevant to kids, that you need to compete with all of the popular cultural forms that are there. And that's been a kind of common youth ministry assumption for at least a couple generations. And I tend to think that we're now at a place where pop culture is so, there's so much of it that it's so, I don't want to necessarily use the word rich. There's definitely some rich pieces of it, but it's everywhere. And it's distinctive and diverse. And so kids are finding their way through it and making meaning with it. And I think if we try to compete at the level of the hyperreal, at the level of the screen, which we tend to sometimes do with worship experiences, as we try to do with our youth rooms to make them feel like the Gap or feel like a kind of adolescent hangout area. Some of that stuff I think is legitimate and we have to do it, and some of it we could even call missional. But I worry that if we get into kind of that cycle of trying to compete within that we actually potentially take a step away from the depth of the gospel itself. That there's something about the gospel, I think, and something relevant about our cultural time, that when we become so enamored with images and screens, that there's certain ways that takes us away from reality. And I think the Christian confession, particularly following Paul, to confess Christ and Him crucified, distinctly leads us into the real, leads us into reality. And I think that's one thing that young people often say, like, I want someone who's real. I want something to be real. And I worry that if our youth ministries are so much trying to compete within the hyperreal, that we actually become disingenuous at the core of our very interaction with them. That we need to think deeply about how do we represent something distinctively real about ourselves, but also something, even more importantly, real about the gospel itself.